Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Educator Yarns. I'm Jess and I am here with the deadly Belinda Huntriss.
Hi, everyone.
This is episode 5, I think, of season 4 of Educator Yarns that we've been doing and sticking to the theme of reconciliation action plans. But before we jump into today's session, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting on today, acknowledge our elders, both past and present, and any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander listeners that are tuning in to this episode. So welcome everybody. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about the RAP action curriculum planning. Belinda and I had a yarn before we jumped on here, and we decided that we are not going to try and do 3 or 4 RAP actions in one podcast episode anymore. We're gassing ourselves trying to get through them and do them justice. So we're just picking one, and curriculum planning is a big one anyway. So we're just going to stick with that for today's episode. But before we jump in, I thought I would just read to you and give you the overview of what curriculum planning means in reference to reconciliation action plans, which are on the Narragansett platform. So the goal is that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories and cultures are included in curriculum planning, development and evaluation across all year levels and learning areas. A review of curriculum documents identifies where the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories and cultures cross-curriculum priority is included and where it could be. Teachers and educators can grow children and students' knowledge through meaningfully teaching about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories and cultures. This is a key driver in the reconciliation process. Teaching Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories and cultures is a requirement and is formally recognised in a cross-curriculum priority for schools and the early years learning framework, which I think it's amazing to see that it finally is a requirement, Belinda, in the early years learning framework, because before
Absolutely.
it kind of was just left open to interpretation and educators' enthusiasm to do it. So to say, no, you're actually required to do this now. I was really relieved to see that inclusion in the ELF this time round.
Absolutely, me too. I think it's asking educators to move beyond that fear. You know, it's like such a common thing. I don't know what I'm worried I'm going to do the wrong thing, so I'm not going to do it at all. And so now it's like, no, we're asking you guys to move beyond that, and to do this and to try and get it right.
Some of the suggestions that Narragansett have is to conduct a curriculum audit. And you and I were having a yarn about this before, that having a curriculum audit, I feel, is somewhat easier to do in a primary and secondary setting than what it potentially is in the early years. You work in a primary space, and so and the work that you do with Twinkle. Do you want to explain a little bit how you're creating resources and doing that planning potentially with your role in Twinkle and what you do there?
Yeah, so my role at Twinkle is the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander content advisor. So one of the main things I'm doing at the moment is auditing, because I guess historically that hasn't been done particularly well in terms of, making sure that authentically and following cultural protocols. So that's what I'm predominantly doing at this point. But one thing I am doing is when we're looking at incorporating resources into whatever curriculum area that they're in, I'm actually currently using the Australian curriculum because we're providing resources for teachers all over Australia and potentially globally. But I guess we're focusing on Australia. So we're using the Australian curriculum, although that I know that people in different areas are still using state curriculums as well. So I guess, like, for me personally, because I have like a pretty good knowledge of how to embed Aboriginal perspectives into kind of anything, without tooting my own horn, that sounds a bit, yeah, and there. I prefer to do it personally, just by looking at the curriculum and coming up with ideas. But there is these areas called elaboration on the Australian curriculum, and if you're clicking on the outcome, whether it be teaching about, I don't know, like understanding seasons, for instance, in stage 1. And then you click on the elaboration and it tells you like pretty much every elaboration has a it's called First Nations now, which is not my preferred terminology, but First Nations elaboration is pretty much for like almost every outcome. So
Okay.
yeah, then it specifically tells you, okay, like look at, if you're talking about looking at seasons, then it's asking you to look at what are your local Aboriginal seasons, for instance, and talk about different seasonal calendars, like, and things like that. So I guess the elaborations and the cross curriculum priorities give you some like kind of descriptive ideas on how to do that. I personally don't particularly like to do it that way. And it's nothing against it. I think that's for people that need that guidance around where to begin.
Yeah.
But I find I love a challenge, obviously, Jess, as we've been yarning about my 4 jobs. But certainly for me, I love the challenge of trying to embed Aboriginal perspectives into just a random outcome that has no hints or tips.
Yeah.
Because really, if you think about the way that, like anything can have an Aboriginal perspective if you go deep enough. So for me, even if it's about, like it's about celebrations, well, one thing, actually a resource that I recently developed for Twinkle, which is based on my family, is about Aboriginal changes in birthdays over time, and how traditionally we'd celebrated, like didn't celebrate birthdays in that certain sense, but certainly there were ceremonies around birthing and women were present, and the child went through different kind of ceremonies at birth, but then today we have birthdays, generally like in a
Yeah,
Western
that's
way.
right.
And so I just like to kind of, just to be creative with it and just see where you can, because I think it's all about building that, build as much cultural knowledge as you can build, can really help you incorporate an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander perspective into any curriculum.
Yeah, and you keep delving and digging a little bit deeper as you go. And in primary and secondary, I suppose you're kind of revisiting the same topics and content at the same time, at the same place, each year, each term. And so, particularly if you're on the same grade, I suppose, year on year, you're building that knowledge and
Yeah.
your experience and resources and so forth. So I think it does become easier somewhat.
Yeah.
And there are so many links. And I think that's what early childhood educators struggle with when we're thinking about the variety of children's questions or topics of inquiry or interest, or whichever way you approach it in your setting, that can arise in in a week. It's really hard sometimes for them to think, well, what is the cultural perspective of that? However, I do remind them that if you've worked in early childhood long enough, interests that are reoccurring, like dinosaurs, under
Yeah.
the sea, out of space, insects, birds, they also are reoccurring. We've all been there and done them
Yes.
before. So they too can be building on their knowledge. But I do like the suggestion on the Narragansett platform where it talks about auditing your curriculum to work out the opportunities to include cultural perspectives, and also, I guess, to sort of review and reflect. I don't know if this ever happens in primary schools or at your school, Belinda, where you look back on the year or back on the term and to audit your curriculum and say, well, did I actually include cultural perspectives where there were these opportunities to do so? And if not, why not? And what can I do to build upon that to do better next term? Does that ever occur in your
I
experience?
think like it's great reflective practice, isn't it? Like I think that's the ideal aim. I think as a teacher, and all teachers will back me up in saying this, the workload's getting so massive, and the requirements of early childhood plus school in schooling systems is insane. So I don't know necessarily, like it's not something probably that I'm doing personally, but I guess my position is totally different. My position is an Aboriginal education teacher, so every single lesson I teach is an Aboriginal perspective. Certainly that would be considered best practice, but I think the way that we've been doing it at our school is that, and again, this depends on what's happening at the term or what. I'm trying to organise this now, and I guess this would be probably planning ahead for the next semester, because we operate in semesters, every 6 months, 2 terms. Would be that I'm going to be meeting with all the classroom teachers and looking over their curriculum and providing advice and guidance around how they're embedding Aboriginal perspectives into their programs. So
Yeah.
that's how we do it. It's kind of like, I guess, planning ahead.
And look, for schools that don't have an Aboriginal education officer like what you're employed to do at your school, that is something that you can also offer to schools through your consultancy, Freshwater Education?
Absolutely. And I think, like that would be sort of around some mentoring or guidance around how to do that, sitting down, having a yarn, talking about what you're doing, what are you struggling with, but also challenging yourself to see, my favorite subject to teach is science, even though I wasn't that great at it at school, but there's so much potential for Aboriginal perspectives in science. Like I just love it. It's amazing. And so, absolutely, that's something that we can do at Freshwater Education and something that we do. And I am actually currently working with a school in the Kimberleys in Western Australia to do exactly that. So,
yeah, nice. And so I think that's, there are some schools and services that are tapped in and they already have that connection or they have that person that's employed, and how lucky are they? But we also know that the majority of schools don't have that. They don't have that. So to be able to lean into somebody like you that has that expertise, I think is so important. And like I tell everybody, I very rarely touch the primary school space. There are some things that I'll do, like, talking about history and culture, and I'll do pedagogy things, but in terms of classroom curriculum content, I don't feel comfortable doing it. I'm not primary school trained. So, and that was one of the reasons as well. Also, I just think you're really cool, but it was just like, I need Belinda. She's the yin to my yang. I needed to come and do this podcast with me.
Yeah, it's been so good bouncing these ideas around. And I think, too, like that we are coming from two different, I'm early childhood as well. So, I've kind of got both covered, but certainly, I felt, again, I'm
you're
such
the yin and the yang
today, Jess. All right. Take a notch down, Belinda, take a notch down. I agree, though. There's, we can't know everything.
Yeah. So some things that I do for early childhood services when I'm working with them, we have like a programming and planning template that we use. And so we have a digital programming and planning guide, which is, I think, $15 on the Koori curriculum website, which has this template in it. Or you also get access to it if you come and do a programming, planning and pedagogy session with us, which is 4 sessions that we run a couple of times a year online, occasionally in person. So in that prompt, it takes you through, well, what is the interest or topic of inquiry? What are your learning goals? What activities and experiences are you planning on doing? How does it link to the early years learning framework? What pedagogies and theories are you leaning into? And there's a box that says, well, what is the cultural perspective? Because I think when we're thinking about curriculum planning, it is that multifaceted approach, right? It is about your play space as an environment, the activities and the experiences that you're setting up, and making sure that cultural perspectives are throughout those. It is about using Aboriginal pedagogies like the 8 ways of learning or possum skin pedagogy to inform your teaching practice. But it's also about curriculum content. So what content is that there's a specific cultural link that you're including? So taking educators through that planning document, I think, is important. I feel that a lot of educators that I'm working with at the moment because exactly what you said, being time poor, no longer have a planning process. They're sort of just doing things on the run and on the fly, and then they spend a lot of their time doing documentation and reporting back on what actually happened and occurred
after the fact.
After the fact. And what I'm trying to say is that by just spending 10 minutes on a planning document from the beginning, it allows you to really be considerate and intentional on how you are including that cultural perspective.
Yeah.
We use something that's called a curriculum wall. So then that would be displayed. And it also invites all families, including Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families, and or your Aboriginal community, to able to come in and see what your intentions are and to provide feedback from the onset before it's occurred. Which I think also is sometimes the missing part, because it talks about, in the early years learning framework, that partnership with Aboriginal families and communities. And I always say, well, how are you including an Aboriginal perspective if you don't know what the perspective is of your community?
Yeah.
You're including cultural content, but unless you've had that consultation, where does that come in? Because where have you approach community or families to say, do you have any ideas or suggestions on how we could add value to this?
So the curriculum wall is about what's happening within the learning, where the journey's going, all of that. So that's keeping them on track that way. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I suppose one of the I don't know, the criticisms of it is that there are lots of different interests that children have all the time, and you can't necessarily do a planning document and a curriculum wall for each and every one of those interests that an individual child may have. And sometimes those are just things that we do in our interactions. And in the same token, not everything that we do in a day has to be documented either. So it's about being intentional in our programming and planning, and what we choose to lift up as well. And that, yeah, so the curriculum wall, I guess, is like that, to display that, or whether you display it in a room or it gets emailed out to families or community members, your RAP working group, whatever it may be.
Yeah.
To say this is something that's been emerging in our classroom that we're going to follow as an inquiry. Here are some things that I'm planning on doing. I would love your feedback. And it's just, it's put out there. I find a lot of educators as well are using our online Facebook group, the Koori Curriculum Educator Community, to do that. So they're saying, oh, there's an interest in mermaids. This is what I'm thinking. Does anyone have any suggestions? And we're really fortunate. We've got a lot of Aboriginal community members that are a part of that group in all throughout Australia. So they're able to share their cultural insights potentially on water spirits and so forth from where they are. So they can also get that consultation informally that way. But I do think it's something that we need to think about, that curriculum partnership when we're doing our programming and planning, which I would assume would be even harder in a school setting.
Well, I guess it just depends on your relationship with the families, but certainly I know that there is a RAP action, and I don't know if it is building relationships with community or Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voices, peoples in the classroom.
Yeah.
But one of them does talk about having community people co-design or collaborate on developing curriculum. So, it is important. And if you've got those relationships with families, with elders, however that's looking, or like you mentioned, a consultant that you might be working with, I think it's super valuable to have that local perspective of what you're teaching. Because I think it's, we're talking about this, RAP is all about, in the spirit of reconciliation, allowing all children and your whole school community or your whole service to come on that journey of working well together and on that path to reconciliation. And that sense of belonging is for everybody, and if you're learning about local context, about local things, that builds that belonging and that connection for everybody.
Yeah, you're too right. I know as well, one of the things that also has worked for us, so we've started to do some mentoring and some training with the services up in Warners Bay. So we did an in-service with them a couple of weeks ago, and they've picked a topic of inquiry based on educator strengths. And I think this is also okay. So one of the educators that's working in the room of children also is a musician. That's something that he has to offer the group of children, and so has decided to do a project on, or an inquiry on, sound. I thought, how cool is that? Oh. So, of course, there's all these little interests that are happening as well, but this is like the umbrella thing that will probably go for the whole year long. And so we sat down and we really mapped that out, using the 8 ways of learning initially, and then also the programming and planning document to sort of sit there and go, well, what are the potentials for including a cultural perspective? So we talked about different children's books that could be used to bring in that. So there's one that's called Sounds All Around Us. It's part of a series. I can't remember the author for that one, but anyway, there's a book about that. We talked about different, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander musicians and the different genres of music that there are, so like Troy Cassar-Daley and country music, and Jessica Mauboy and Casey and Thelma Plum and Dan Sultan and all the legends, all the amazing people. So we talked about them exploring different genres of music, different types of instruments, so traditional and contemporary. And then we also talked about tracking the seasons and times of day by recording sounds periodically. Wow. So, I can hear kookaburras right now. I don't know if you can hear that with the headphones, but, in the morning when I'm up, early with Jessie James, the kookaburras kick off and then the magpies join in, and that's, from about 5:30 in the morning. And then we've got the frogs that start tuning in. Earlier in the year, we had lots of crickets and cicadas. They've dropped way off now,
that's cool.
way off. So thinking about, what can you hear? It's raining today on Dark and Young Country. So if you're looking at that, so if you're, say you're doing these recordings, you know, some services open, they run from 7 o'clock in the morning or 6 o'clock in the morning to 6 o'clock at night.
Yeah.
So every hour on the hour going outside into your nature classroom and recording the sounds that are all around you, maybe also doing some Dadiri work with children, but then comparing some of those sounds month on month, season on season, to see how things have changed, you know, the crunching of the autumn leaves and so forth
Yeah, that's
underfoot.
so cool.
So anyway, I'm super excited about that project, but it's something that you can sort of see by sitting down and doing that planning together. We're able to sort of come up with these ideas and these suggestions. And I think that's the benefit of services and schools working with education consultants, because we have that knowledge to be able to support, and we have those ideas and we know the resources that are available. And then once you've been a part of that practice and that process a couple of times, I feel educators feel a lot more confident and are a lot more capable to run with it on their own and be a bit more independent
empowered.
with it. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. So, I mean, it sounds biased coming from two education consultants, but I can definitely see the benefit, you know, that of services that we've worked with, and how we're able to add that value. In schools, do you do things like resource audits to see where there's gaps and areas for improvement? What does that usually look like?
Absolutely. And sorry, something's dinging in the background of my computer here. Well, I know that when I first started in my role at our school, which is called Our Lady of Lourdes Primary School, Taro. So I'm in a little Catholic school. We've just got over 200 children. It's an amazing little school. Just doing a shout out to the mob at Taro. But absolutely, like I did a library audit. So I basically pulled the whole library apart, looking for every single Aboriginal resource that we had. I found some books in there from like 1970, and as you could imagine, that was not long not long after Aboriginal people, you know, got the vote in 1963 or whatever. So it was like a very different time.
The exclusion on demand policy was still in place in the 70s.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So I think, and it also helped me to identify what the gaps are, like what we don't have. So yeah, I think an audit of your books specifically is amazing. Also looking at, you know, what resources that we have for, you know, for teachers' professional development. And because I know I've been looking, you know, there's a lot more online stuff now. There's a lot of great, you know, like you mentioned Wingaru Education. They do online lessons and things too, don't they?
Yeah, I'm not a member of Wingari, but I do know that they have really great pre-made classroom content for children. I don't know that they do PD for educators. They may. I mean, I'm not overly familiar with that side of their business if they do.
But they do have lessons and things like that. Yeah,
great. Yeah, really great. Yeah, I've heard great things about Wingaru.
Yeah, so I've been auditing our, you know, like teacher lesson plans that have been made. You know, there's these old school books that are like hizzy books that teach like worksheets and stuff like that. And some of the content that I've come across is just really not culturally appropriate. So I think even if you can do that as a yearly practice, you know, once you start to learn, you know, more that you know about cultural awareness and doing the right thing in cultural protocols, and then I think that becomes a regular thing that you just do it, you know, do at the start of the year or the end of the year, once you're, you know, at school, things start quietening down. We're doing Christmas activities. Kids are wearing Christmas clothes. We know that's when it's time to start prepping our stuff ready for next year. So I think it's a great practice to do if you can audit your resources. Absolutely.
Yeah, we have a little guide, which I'll link in the show notes, which is on how to create a First Nations children's library and like the different types of books that should be included. And awesome. We also have another guide of things to consider before sharing dreaming stories with children. Because I know that, you know, in the 70s and 80s, if there was one type of Aboriginal book that would be in a collection, it was always those dreaming stories, but we have to be very mindful of how they were created and so forth. So, but I mean, I don't know if you are the same mind of me, but for me, if you're only going to have one resource, you always go with children's books. I mean, because they just have that springboard and to go off into all these different areas. And I just feel like there's so many opportunities to bring in cultural perspectives through children's books and to learn. And for educators who aren't confident to stand behind the voice of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that are captured in this story. They're learning alongside. They don't have to come up with the answers. I think books are so powerful. So
There's so many great, amazing, like the thing I'm always kind of harping on about to educators is, making sure that we present a balanced view of books. So, are we presenting books that, maybe represent like a pre-colonial time is fine, but are we also balancing that with like, what's it like to be a blackfella today? What's it like to be a blackfella living in Redfern? What's it like to be a blackfella that has red hair? Like we need to have books that represent Aboriginal people across a wide, like how diverse Aboriginal people are. So I think that's super important.
and some of those stories haven't even been created yet, but it's growing. Like that space is just growing so rapidly. There's this new book. I have to do a shout out to Greg Dryce. I don't know if people have Greg Dryce's collection. If you don't, you really should. He's got like the bird collection, Silly Birds, Cuckoo Kookaburra, and whatever. This new one just came up, Circles of Life. And it is just so beautiful. And it just so happened. I just finished writing a lesson plan on time. So how to bring in a cultural perspective of time. And we were thinking about shadows and, creating sundials and looking at time of day and all that sort of stuff. And again, listening to sounds and so forth. But then also thinking about seasons or a way of marking time and the circle of life. So that whole circle, that's another way of time as well. But it's just such a beautiful book that Greg's created. I don't know why I'm holding it up when it's a podcast, because there's also a YouTube, people that are listening. If you want to see Belinda, you can watch it on YouTube. But it's I don't know. There's just more and more books coming out. Ash Barty just brought out her first children's book, children's picture book, I should say. Yeah. And it's about a mother that's expecting her first child to be born, which is just so, so special. So there's no limit to it, I guess. So you mentioned before that science is your favorite way to bring in culture perspectives. What's been one of your favorite ways of doing that?
So I think we do a unit, like, so our cycles run in 2-year cycles with what we're like curriculum based. There's a unit that we do called Build It Up, and it's like learning about, building materials and sustainability and, what do we use to make things. And it's a stage 3, so it's like year 5 and 6. And my favorite thing to do is get the children to think about, like, we talk about problems with overcrowded housing, like looking at some of the contemporary housing issues that Aboriginal people in many communities face. We talk about what a house plan looks like and looking at blueprints and stuff like that. And then the children use what they know, what we've been talking about in terms of the importance of connection to country, the importance of extended family and the role of like Aboriginal families like living together. And then I give them a budget and they look at creating their own house plan to build a house that has connection to country and extended family for Aboriginal families in a particular community. So like I love that lesson. $1 million used to be my budget. That's not going to cut it anymore. We're probably looking at 5 million now. But it's so amazing to see like some of and then they actually like put them on a blueprint and like full design and like talk about the budgets and materials and stuff. And so they love that because it's practical, it's hands-on, and it's fun. Who doesn't want to be a millionaire with and so I love that. Some of the designs that I've seen is things like they have a garden inside their house, like a circular house that has a garden with all native plants in it. A lot of their houses have footy fields in the backyards, like so that kids can kick the footy around with their cousins in the extended family and stuff. That's one of my favorite ones. I also really love teaching about cultural burning because I think that's a super, like, such a great thing that is being revitalized in terms of, reducing those fossil fuels and, looking after country properly through fire. I love teaching about that, about like we go out and we look at, what's the season, what's the weather like, is this optimum conditions for burning and things like that. So like there's so much. I've even done a unit of work on, there's a unit that we do in stage 2, which is year 3 and year 4, and it's about force. And so it's about looking at, like how do objects move? So, our objects move by propelling it. So, if we're pushing a marble, that's how the marble moves from gravity and stuff. And so I've done a whole unit about force and how we use, like how boomerangs are made and what they're made from and how they're thrown and how they come back and like all the science behind how they work. So I think there's so much in science that you could do. And that's why I'm so glad that STEM is now becoming such a big focus. And there's so much, even like Aboriginal astronomy, like, oh gosh, I'm so passionate about science, Jess.
Look at you. I think
really
those ideas sound cool. I need to come and visit your school now. I want to come and be in your classroom for the day.
come.
I think you're going to have to set up a tour bus because I think people that are listening are all going to want to come as well. We'll all be going, Belinda's bus tours. There you go. Another.
And on that note, actually, because we've got this thing that we're just always trying to get mob to come out and share their story. We have a cultural program every fortnight called Culture Yarns. And actually on that sound thing, Jess, we've been doing this amazing, I've got my cousin who's an amazing musician music producer. So he's been coming out to our school. The kids have been recording sounds, random sounds like paintbrushes tapping on the ground. And he's made it into this amazing song, which we're now rapping to about identity. So it's amazing. But we're always looking for people. If anyone's based around Newcastle, Central Coast, or even if you want to come for a road trip, come and have a yarn. We'd love to hear, especially from Mob, just to come and share their story, because we've got children at our school from such a diverse range of levels of connectedness to different parts of the country and all of that. And we just love hearing from Mob. Come and have a yarn and tell us about your life. So that'd be cool.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'll come up with you one day for sure. I love to.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I wonder if once you finish that, if we can get permission to play it on the podcast with the children.
I'm sure we could.
We should get them on. We should interview them about what they're making. Let's interview them about their project. Yeah, nice. Cool. I love that. All right, Dove. Well, that's been another episode of Educator Yarns talking about curriculum planning. I'm glad. Look, we've learned our lesson. We did one and it took up a full episode. We're learning. We're learning.
I feel like we only just scraped the surface on that one too.
That's right. If you liked the episode, if you can give us a review, that would be amazing because it makes us discoverable for more listeners and we know that people are out there paying attention to what we have to say. If you have a question or a topic that you'd like to cover in one of our episodes, please reach out and please give Freshwater Education and Koori Curriculum a follow on social media so you can stay in touch and see all the amazing things that are happening outside of this podcast that we've both got going on. So thanks so much everyone for tuning in and we'll yarn again soon. Bye for now.
Stay deadly.